Hi everyone, happy Friday. For me, it's casual Friday, so no collared shirt on Fridays. I want to continue the conversation on race. I realize that this is a longer conversation than reading one or a couple of books. It's longer than some short videos and some things like that. The idea, again, as a reminder, is just to give you a sense of kind of how I begin to approach a topic, an ethical topic that's pressing in on us as a person, as a church, or as a culture. And so this is such an important topic. I thought that I would just kind of extend this one outward. So it will probably spill into, well, I know for sure it will spill into next week, which the readings overlap and dovetail quite nicely with this week's readings from Park. I've really appreciated for those of you that have posted in the forum on racial conflict and healing both your academic reflections, but also your personal reflections, and for a lot of you, kind of the identification, especially for minoritized communities in America, the identification of the idea of Han with the idea of Han. And so I have really appreciated your personal reflections on that. I'm trying to respond to everybody in the forum this week. So I will get there eventually over the weekend, but I'm trying to respond to everyone. So I want to take up this idea of and kind of add some texture to the idea of embrace. And yesterday I talked about Miroslav Volf's four movements of embrace: the opening of the arms or identity, the waiting or vulnerability, the closing of the arms and in embrace, and the grace that comes alongside of that and along with that, and the love that comes along with that. And then also then again the opening of the arms in order to release somebody to be all that they God created them to be. So I want to kind of add a little bit more, like I said, texture to some of these ideas. So I want to talk today about identity, which is such an important concept. And I want to reference a couple books that I'm working from and kind of drawing from. The first one is The Christian Imagination, which I mentioned yesterday, by Willie James Jennings, which I think is one of probably the top 5 books that I've read on the conversation on race and how in the Western world we've been living inside this diseased social imagination of whiteness being the idealization of humanity. And if I were to title this lecture, I would title it Whiteness is Not an Ethnicity, It's an Ideology. That for us in America, especially people that look like me, your ethnicity got lost around 1691, 1692, when all European Americans began to receive benefits for being considered under the category of quote unquote white. And so you'll hear more about that if you listen to episode 3 of Seeing White in the podcast Seeing on Radio. So yeah, that's the title. So one of the things that we need to do with our identity is we need to walk back this idea of an idealized picture of humanity. We get this from racial construction, but we also get this from some of the conclusions of evolutionary theory. This is not an argument against evolutionary theory. It's an argument that takes the idea of evolutionary theory and says that some people or some race is more evolved than another race because they're judging them, like we talked about 2 days ago, they're judging them by their own standards. So I want to talk about identity, how to form it, how to shape it, and how it's been misshapen, and then talk about what do we do moving forward as Christ recenters our identity. And so the first thing that I want to do is talk about in the Christian Imagination. Dr. Jennings talks about the ancient identity markers are tribe, land, and vocation. So you get your identity from your people or your tribe. You get your identity and your moral formation from the land that you live in. So a lot of tribal cultures teach morality not through didactic teaching like maybe we're doing here, but by taking people on a journey and telling stories on that journey. So every time they go by these landmarks or these places, they listen to stories or they remember the stories, and it teaches moral lessons. So tribe, land, and then finally vocation. What you do, what your family did. My last name is Sanders. At some point, it kind of has an English origin, and so at some point, I would say that my family has done some kind of work with wood, whatever that might look like. And so, yeah, way back in the day. So those are the identity markers in the ancient world. When we begin to do this, what I described a couple days ago in the exploration, the doctrine of discovery, those kinds of things, we begin to redefine identity when we create an idealized humanity. And that redefinition takes it away from the community, our tribe, our land, and our vocation, and moves it to external features of a people, their skin color, their bodily features, their cultural, even some of their cultural characteristics. And we begin to shift our notion of identity to those things and away from tribe, land, and vocation. And this happens for two reasons, really. One is the forced migration of Africans. You take them away from tribe, you take them away from their land, and you take them away from their vocation, and you give them all these new things in a new land that they didn't voluntarily come for, and you're changing their identity. There's also the displacement of native peoples. When Europeans arrived on the Americas, they displaced native peoples, and then they lost their landmarks, they lost their moral formation, some lost tribal identities, etc., and they lost certain vocations. So you begin to see how this identity is shifting, and then when you get to something like in the 1950s and 1960s in the academy, but then later in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s in the Cultural Revolution, you begin to move from this modern definition of identity in these external characteristics to an internal definition. So we identify ourselves by our sexuality, our particular religion, our gender, our political affiliation, even different group affiliations. And one of the reasons that we do that we bring our identity from these external characteristics to internal characteristics is because people use these external characteristics to oppress. And so we want to avoid that. And one way to do that is to bring it inward. I don't know if you've ever had this kind of training, but when you share your faith, right, you can share the arguments for the existence of God, and people can argue and debate those things. But when you share your testimony or your personal encounter of God, it's very hard to contest with that, because that's your inward personal experience. And that's kind of what's happened to identity over time, is taking it from tribe and land and vocation and moved it inward into and so people can't oppress you, because you get to define your identity. The trouble with that, the challenge with that, is that identity is malleable, that it changes over time. When you have children, you become a father. That's a different part of your identity. When you get married, if you get married, you have a different kind of identity. If you take on a new job, something like that, or a new role in your job, that changes your identity. When you're in relationships and different friendships, that affects your identity. And so all of these things are so important to who we are and how we understand ourselves. And so when we move our identity inward, that traps us inside of ourselves, and it actually collapses our identity into something smaller than what it actually is. So what I want to do in the next lecture, and I always have to stop these about 10 to 12 minutes because YouTube won't let me allow or won't allow me to go to the 15 or 20-minute mark. It just is too much to upload. So I always have to stop these at 10 minutes. Plus, I think for these kinds of lectures, when you're just watching a video, hopefully you're walking in the park or doing something and just listening to it. You don't always have to just watch the video, but hopefully you're listening to it. And for these kinds of videos, 10 minutes is enough. And then you can take it at your own time. So I'll come back and we'll look at Philippians chapter 3 and the identity, the great identity passage in the New Testament when Paul talks about his ascribed identity and his acquired identity, and then he talks about it in relationship to his relationship with Christ.